Is $100 all you really need to be able to enjoy listening to music? And with Fosi Audio's IM4 in-ear monitors, I reckon it is. Now, Fosi Audio were the makers of those fairly generic looking pieces of audio gear that you saw on Amazon or eBay. And in the last couple of years, they've suddenly gone all fancy, started making some nicer looking audio gear. And not only have they produced their own headphones, but also their own in-ear monitors. And for, well, $99.99, essentially $100, I actually think they've done a pretty good job. And when I was at CanJam and had a listen, I was pretty impressed enough that I asked them to send over a pair for me to review. So I thought it would be interesting to see how good you get a pair of IEMs for around $100. Before I go any further, I'd like to thank Andrew at Bloom Audio for sponsoring my channel. Andrew and his team aim to treat their customers like family and have the highest customer service standards possible. You can check out their huge range online, including Fosi's IM4s or a great deal of IEMs, headphones, and other audio gear in their room at any major US CanJam. Likewise, if you do have a pair of IM4s or you end up buying a pair, do let me know in the comments below what you think of them, as that is very, very valuable feedback, not just for me, but for anyone else looking to buy a pair of IM4s or any other audio gear, as I aim for these reviews to be useful for everyone regardless of who's sponsoring them. Now, they use a single 10mm dynamic driver, which is basically a miniature version of what you get in regular full-sized headphones, and inside a slightly, well, specially customized chamber, and with 3 different sets of ear tips from the balanced set, which is kind of wide bore, and the bass set, which has a black core, and then the deep bass set, and also with a set of removable and changeable cores with aluminium or brass. You have up to 6 different tunings that you can set them to for your listening preferences, and for $100 I think that's pretty good. Maybe the only thing, you only get a 3.5mm termination, which is enough for that kind of price, but also you don't get any kind of USB DAC amp, so you're going to need some kind of device with a 3.5mm socket if you're going to listen with them. Now, my listening experience with them was actually surprisingly good. I started off with the balanced ear tips, that's the widest bore ones. Now, typical old school dynamic driver IEMs are very susceptible to the bore size of the ear tips you use. The wider the bore, the less bass. The narrower the bore, the more bass. And that's essentially what you get with the ear tips here, as well as the nozzles, as the aluminium nozzles have a slight restrictor in the tip, which obviously has some influence on the bass and treble balance. Now, starting with good old Diana Kamien's Guten Morgen Duften. Sorry, I'm not German, so I hope I pronounced that correctly. I don't really detect any high frequency harshness with these, but even though the bass is very punchy, even with those wider bore tips, the percussion is maybe a touch flat. But, you know, again, $100 IEMs, so I'm not really expecting great things there. But the overall sound, albeit being a bit congested, I mean, you're not going to get massive instrument separation and detail out of something that's $100, it actually does a pretty good job of being very easy to listen with, and there was a good amount of separation of the bass and the other frequencies that I could enjoy them. Switching randomly through a playlist to Expander by Bonobo, and this with the switching in the bass tips to see how much of effect that had, and of course switching to the bass tips versus the balance tips, you get, well, a bit more bass, and with the occasional note came through slightly distorted, so I suspect they may well have a resonance at some point in the frequency range that may interact with some bass heavy music, but for the most part they actually were very punchy and fun. And then switching to the deep bass tips, which are, if you have been around the IEM world for a long time, those generic narrow nozzle, well, chamfered narrow nozzle tips, which I've seen even 10 years ago, they increase the bass a bit more, but they don't damp down the treble too much for my tastes. Actually, they keep it nicely in check. So then switching randomly again to other tracks, I came across Broad Rock by Butcher Brown, which is a funk jazz quartet, and actually quite a good one at that. I was surprised how good jazz sounded through the IM4s, all things considered, maybe only with the cymbals sounding somewhat splashy and the soundstage pretty much being one big, if actually somewhat wide blob. And experimenting with switching the tips, I was pretty happy with all of them, from the balance through to the deep bass ones, which I actually ended up selecting even though maybe they're a little bit off neutral, mainly to keep the higher frequencies in check, which in IEMs I tend to be sensitive to any kind of distortion. Now, inside the case, of course, I mentioned they have a set of brass nozzles. Now, comparing them to the standard black nozzles, they don't have the restriction at the tip that the black ones do, And then keeping the deep bass tips on, the brass nozzles open up the mid-range and treble nicely, and the percussion seems to improve a little bit. And the bass punches actually very well at the moderate listening levels I listen at without interfering with the rest of the soundstage, just keeping things nice and warm. Now in this state, that slight V-shaped tuning that they have as a result, something like Beth Orton's Thinking About Tomorrow, well, at a quieter listening level, because it happened to be a bit quieter than the bonobo I was listening to before, it had a pleasant, gentle, filling bass that isn't overwhelming. And the overall sound is somewhat muted, obviously. It's on the quite far into the warm side versus a lot of in-ear monitors. But then Beth Orton's album isn't particularly bright to begin with anyway. The overall experience ends up being very easy listening without too much to draw one into the music. I've noticed a lot of people buy cheaper headphones and IEMs because they don't want to get too drawn into the music while working. And the IM4s I think will be really good for that. I used them out of my MacBook Pro, which was an ideal match for something in this kind of price range. And I found that it is very easy to listen to and enjoy music without overthinking it or over worrying about what I was using or the details or anything that would generally go under the title of being audiophilia nervosa. I could just relax, enjoy and listening, even if I was aware that, I wasn't getting the kind of higher level detail and separation that, obviously I get out of a lot of the gear that is around me. So I reckon that for a pair of easy listening IEMs that are entertaining enough and fun enough, especially at my moderate listening level that I listen to music at, or a pair of IEMs for someone interested in trying a pair of wired IEMs that's used to say AirPods Pro or some kind of wireless IEMs and want to know what it's all about. Now you're going to need something obviously with an audio output like either a computer or dongle DAC or, I don't know if any phones still have any 3.5mm outputs. So that's something to consider. But in that regard, I'm actually pretty impressed what you can get for $100. And I think I'll be keeping these by my MacBook Pro for those times when I'm listening to, say, NPR Tiny Desk concerts or doing some music discovery, trying to find some new stuff to listen to, or that kind of thing where I don't want to over-focus on what I'm listening to.